Adam and Eve once lived in perfection. They lived in safety and protection. One day, a serpent spoke, and suddenly there was deception. The woman wanted something she already had. Be like God, the serpent said. You won't die. That was the lie. And just like that, she and her husband took a bite, promised wisdom, but instead given shame. They both began to blame. What was once a true partnership was now severed. They hid from their creator because of that lie and their inability to take responsibility. And so they were banished from their garden home, made to work for everything they ever needed. They settled into their new lives outside of Eden, but sin was not done with its evil work. Adam and Eve had children of their own, Cain and Abel. One was acceptable before God, the other wasn't. Brother killed brother out of jealousy and hatred. Abel's blood cried out to God. Cain banished, just like his parents, forced to wander the earth. But do you remember? Back in Genesis 3:15, when God cursed the serpent, he made a promise. He said, he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. This is God's first promise of Jesus. But how? Abel is dead, Cain is banished. Or is there another? Someone from whose line Jesus will eventually come? This is exactly what we are going to figure out in this final episode of the narrative of Adam and Eve. Before we get into today's episode, I want to take a moment to remind you guys about the Exploring the Bible merch shop. Today, I want to highlight the Season 2 merchandise. We have a lot of fun stickers with the Season 2 logo on it. We also have a black t-shirt with the logo, and that t-shirt is available in sizes small through 3X. And a turquoise razorback tank top with the logo on it, and that's also available in sizes extra small through 2X. And last but not certainly least, a tote bag with the Season 2 logo on it. So please check out all of these items and much more that is in the merch store. The link will be in the description of this episode. So don't forget, throughout June, if you purchase $75 worth of merchandise or more, you can use the code EXPLORE, that's EXPLORE, at checkout for free shipping. And thank you so much for your support. Welcome back to another episode of Exploring the Bible. I am so excited because today we have reached the season finale of Season 2. If you are new here, welcome. I'm glad you found us. On this podcast, we explore the narratives of the Bible, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, stepping back into biblical history to see what lessons we can learn, what warnings we can receive, and most importantly, to see God's love and mercy woven through every single story. If you are returning for another episode, welcome back. Thank you so much for your continued support. Today's episode, we are going to cover Genesis 4:17 through 26. Now, if you're sitting there thinking 10 verses is a lot to cover in one episode, I completely understand. But unlike our other episodes, we are not going to strictly go verse by verse today, because there's so much happening in these 10 verses. Instead, we are going to step back and look at the bigger picture of what God is showing us here. And I promise you, it is worth it. So let's set the scene before we dive in. In our last episode, we walked through the heartbreaking story of Cain killing Abel. We saw how Cain's anger and jealousy led to the first murder in human history. We see how God confronted him, how Cain was cursed, and how God, in his mercy, still placed a mark of protection on Cain, even after what he had done. Cain was sent out to wander east of Eden in a land called Nod, which also, if you remember, means wanderer. That is right where today's passage picks up. Let's read Genesis 4:17 together. Cain knew his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain then built a city and named it after his son Enoch. Right away, these verses raise two separate questions, and I think they're both worth addressing. The first question And I know it's one that a lot of people have wondered about. Where did Cain's wife come from? Think about what we know up to this point in the narrative. We have only been introduced to four people: Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Abel is dead. So, where did Cain's wife come from? If you remember in our last episode, we talked about how Cain was afraid someone was going to kill him after he was cursed. And we concluded that the people he feared had to have been the other children of Adam and Eve, who simply just weren't mentioned by name in the biblical text. The Bible doesn't record every birth, every child, every detail of these early generations. So we have to conclude that given there were no other people on earth, Cain's wife was one of his sisters. I can almost guess what you are thinking right now. And it goes something along the lines of, that's just wrong. And honestly, by today's standards, I completely understand that reaction. But here is where we need to be careful as students of the Bible. When we are looking at ancient history, we need to take off the lenses of our own time period and remember that the world back then was very different. Today, there are genetic risks of close relatives having children together. But in those earliest generations of humanity, when the human genetic code was still pristine and the effects of sin had not yet compounded over thousands of years, the risks did not yet exist the way they do now. And here's the thing: God Himself does not prohibit this practice until much, much later in history. It isn't until the time of Moses and Leviticus and Deuteronomy that God finally establishes the law against marrying close relatives. Even Abraham, the father of our faith, married his half sister Sarah, and God never condemned him for it. So while it may feel wrong to us in 2026, we can't project our culture and our scientific understanding backward onto a completely different world. So the simple answer is this: yes, Cain married his sister, and together they had a son named Enoch. Now, the second thing this verse tells us about is that Cain built a city. He named it after his son Enoch. This might seem like a small detail, but it actually reveals something important about Cain's heart. Think back to what God had said to Cain as part of his curse. God told him he would be a restless wanderer on the earth. In other words, Cain was supposed to have no permanent home. But instead of accepting God's judgment, what does Cain do? He builds a city. He plants roots. He puts his own family's name on it, as to say, this is my legacy. This is my kingdom. Cain was more focused on building a name for himself and bringing glory to his own family than he was on God. And we are going to see this attitude come up over and over again as we continue to go through the Bible. Now let's move on to verses 18 through 22, which traces Cain's family line through several generations. We're not going to read through each verse individually, but I want to highlight a few things that stand out. In verse 18 gives us the genealogy. 5 generations from Cain, we arrive at a man named Lamech. Now remember this name, and I know I probably butchered that and I apologize, but I listened to it about 15 times and that's the best way I can pronounce it. We are going to come back to him in just a few minutes. But first, I want to look at verse 20 through 22, because they actually recorded some remarkable advances in human civilization. Lamech had several children, and each of them is credited with pioneering something significant in human history. His first son was the first to raise livestock and live in tents. His second son was the first to play the harp and the flute, and his third son forged tools out of bronze and iron. Now, I find this fascinating because these innovations, livestock, music, metalworking, are still things that we benefit from today. They have come from Cain's lineage. This tells us something important. God's common grace extends, even to those who are far from him. Cain's descendants were not walking with God, but God allowed them to contribute to human civilization. He allowed their gifts and creativity to flourish. That's what theologians call common grace, the blessing God gives to all people, regardless whether they follow him or not. But now let's talk about Lamech, because Lamech takes everything that has been simmering in Cain's lineage and turns it up to a terrifying level. Let's read verse 23 and 24. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zilith, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Where do we even begin with this? Let's start at the most obvious thing. He had 2 wives. We go all the way back to Genesis 2 to remember that from the beginning, God's design for marriage was 1 man and 1 woman. When God created Eve and brought her to Adam, he established this design clearly. Lamech is the first person in the Bible to break it, choosing to take 2 wives. And then we see the kind of man that Lamech is. And we understand that his disregard for God's design in marriage was just the beginning. Because Lamech didn't just break God's law about marriage, he bragged to his own wives, that he had killed a man, not in self-defense with remorse, not with any sense of grief or accountability. He said it as if it was a trophy. I killed a man who wounded me. I killed a young man who injured me. There is no sorrow here. There is no shame. He's actually celebrating this. And then he compares himself to God. He says, if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Do you see what he's doing? When God placed the mark on Cain, he said that anyone who killed Cain would suffer vengeance 7 times over. That was God's declaration. But Lamech takes this and cranks it up. He says, I am worth more than Cain. Anyone who comes after me will face 77 times the retribution. He is not just proud of his violence, but he is positioning himself as greater than God. This is the trajectory of Cain's lineage. It starts with jealousy and murder, and it grows into polygamy and boasting, and ends with a man who genuinely believes he is above God's authority. Do you see how sin works? It never stays the same size. It always grows. What started as Cain being angry at what his brother has, within 5 generations, produced a man who openly mocked the concept of divine justice. And this brings us back to the question that we started from the very beginning of this episode. Was God's promise. God promised back in Genesis 3:15 that a descendant would come who would crush the serpent's head. That promise pointed to Jesus. And looking at everything we have just covered, Abel is dead, and Cain's lineage is growing more and more corrupt by the generation. So how would God keep his word? Where is this promised one coming from? And that is exactly where God steps in. Let's read the final 2 verses of this passage. The final 2 verses of the entire narrative of Adam and Eve and their family. Verse 25 says, Adam knew his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, and named the son Seth, saying, God granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Verse 26 says, Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. And at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. I want to stop here, and I want to sit just for a moment, because these 2 verses carry so much weight. Notice that Eve is the one who speaks here. Just as Eve was the first human voice to speak with the serpent back in Genesis 3, She is also the last voice to speak in the narrative of her family. And what does she say? She says, God has granted me another child in place of Abel. Eve has hope again. The text doesn't spend a lot of time on what Adam and Eve felt when Abel was murdered. We don't get a long passage about their grief, but I think about it as a parent for a moment. They lost one son to death and the other son to banishment, both on the same day. And beyond that personal grief, there had to have been something weighing on them, the loss of a promise. Ever since God spoke those words in the garden, He will strike your head, Adam and Eve had been carrying hope with them. Would it be through Abel that this promised one would come? And then Abel was gone. But God's mercy shows up again, as it always does, and Seth is born. And Eve, in her wisdom, recognizes him as a gift from God. She names him Seth, which in Hebrew means appointed or granted. God appointed this child. He was not an accident. He was not a replacement in the way we might dismiss something. Oh, well, there's another one. He was God's deliberate provision in the middle of a devastating loss. And the final words of this entire narrative are among the most beautiful in all of Genesis. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Seth and his descendants chose a different path than Cain's family. While Cain's line was building cities, forging weapons, boasting of murder, Seth's line was calling on the name of God. They were worshiping, they were seeking, they were walking as closely as they could with God. And it is from this line, Seth's line, that the genealogy of Jesus will eventually come. If we fast forward to Luke 3, where Luke traces the genealogy of Jesus all the way back through history, he goes through the line of Seth. God's promise was not derailed by Abel's death. It was not interrupted by Cain's sin. It was not threatened by Lamech's arrogance. God simply, quietly, faithfully continued his plan through a new son, a new line, a new beginning. So, what do we take away from all of this? I have just one main lesson today, and I think it's one of the most important lessons in the entire Bible. God's plans always happen. Let that sink in for a second. God's plans always happen. It doesn't always happen the way we expect it. It doesn't always happen on the timeline we hope for. It doesn't always look the way we thought it would look. But it always happens. When God says something, he does it. Think about everything that stood between Genesis 3:15, the promise, and the birth of Jesus. A murder, a banishment, corruption, generations of people turning farther and farther from God. And yet, through every single one of these obstacles, God's plan moved forward, quietly, steadily, unstoppable. And here is the personal application that I want you to hold on to. I know that some of you are in a season right now where you can't see how God is going to come through. Maybe you've been waiting on a promise for a long time and it looks like nothing is moving. Maybe something happened in your life, a loss, a setback, even a failure, and it seems like God's plan has been derailed. Maybe like Eve standing over Abel's grave, you're wondering how anything good can come possibly from where you are right now. I want to speak directly to that. God is not surprised by Abel's death. He was not scrambling to find a new plan when Cain was banished. He already knew about Seth. He already knew about the line that would lead to the manger in Bethlehem and to the cross on Calvary. And wherever you are walking through right now, he already knows about that too. He is not surprised. He is not worried. He has not forgotten you. His word says that he cares for you. And you can bank on that. Because if it says it, it's true. God doesn't walk away. He doesn't give up. He doesn't run out of ways to work things out. He is the God that brings life from death, hope from grief, and promises of completion. Even when human circumstances say it should be impossible, it isn't with God. That is the God of Genesis 4, and He is still the same God today. Thank you so much for joining me for this very special episode of Exploring the Bible. We have done it. Season 2 is complete. We are officially leaving Adam and Eve and their family behind. But don't worry, we are nowhere near done with this incredible journey. In season 3, we are going to be exploring the narrative of Noah and his family. And I have to tell you, this is going to be so much fun because we are going to step well outside of what we've learned in Sunday school. We are going to deep dive into the details that are jam packed into 4 chapters about Noah. I can't wait to unpack this with you. I hope you enjoyed this season and this episode. And if you have, please remember to follow this podcast because season 3 will be coming in the next few weeks and you don't want to miss it. And if you know someone who loves to look at the Bible this way, or maybe they just need to hear how much God loves them, then please share it with them. It is truly the best way you can support the show. And as always, please leave a review. I would love to keep the conversation going. I want to hear your thoughts, your questions, and anything else you want to share. And I will see you guys in season 3. And as always, God bless.